Hi, everyone. I'm Caitlin Huey-Burns in for Elaine Quijano tonight. It's great to be with you. Hope you're having a great week. Thanks for joining us. Let's get to the news. President Biden is making a new pledge to fight climate change as he tries to place the U.S. back at the center of global climate policy. The president kicked off a two-day climate summit on Thursday with 40 leaders from around the globe. The White House says that by the end of this decade, it wants the country's greenhouse gas emissions to be half of what they were in 2005. The White House also says that by the end of Mr. Biden's first term, it wants to double its annual climate financing to help developing countries go green. According to the president, the time for change is now.
The signs are unmistakable. The science is undeniable. But the cost of inaction keeps mounting. The United States isn't waiting. We are resolving to take action. Not only our federal government, but our cities and our states all across our country. But the truth is, America represents less than 15% of the world's emissions. No nation can solve this crisis on our own, as I know you all fully understand. All of us, and particularly those of us who represent the world's largest economies, we have to step up.
President Biden's ability to build a greener economy will hinge on his infrastructure plan. Republicans rolled out their counter to the president's $2 trillion proposal on Thursday. They're focusing on what they call real infrastructure. That includes areas like roads, transit, and broadband. The $568 billion proposal is about a quarter of the White House's plan. It also makes no direct mention of climate change or emissions. On Thursday, Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer said that any infrastructure bill the chamber considers must include clean jobs. Here's West Virginia Republican Senator Shelley Moore Capito in response.
We see the future. We may see it differently than President Biden in terms of, what is it, $160 billion incentive to buy an electric vehicle. That's not in here, you're right. But realizing the infrastructure part of that could be a part of a bipartisan bill. That's something that we've talked about. So I wouldn't say that that's exclusive of this. And I think we fully expect, and I haven't really run this by my folks up here, but I think we fully expect when we get to the negotiating phase that climate will be a part of the discussion.
CBS News senior national and environmental correspondent Ben Tracy joins me now for a deeper look at the state of U.S. climate policy. Ben, we've been following your great reporting on this, so I'm so glad you join us to help break us down. Can you help us understand the actual steps the U.S. has to make to reach this goal by 2020?
Yeah, that's a great question. I actually asked the White House that question during a background call they did for reporters, and they're not putting out a detailed plan yet. They're basically saying that they think there are multiple pathways for them to reach this goal. They think the goal is ambitious, but that it is absolutely doable and that they might even exceed it. But so far, they are not putting out a roadmap of how we actually get there. And let's underscore this. I mean, you cannot underscore how enormous this challenge would be. This would change everything from how and what we drive to how we power our homes, our offices, our factories, how we farm, what we eat. Just to give you two examples, right now, 2% of the vehicles on the road are electric vehicles. To reach this goal by 2030, we would need 2/3 of all vehicles sold to be electric. And another example, by 2030, we would need half of the energy in this country to come from renewable energy. That's wind, solar, hydro. Right now, it's only 1/5. So we would have to make really big changes and do them on a very quick time frame to reach this goal that the president has laid out.
And what will it take from Congress potentially? I mean, is this something that the president can make happen all by himself, or does Congress have to weigh in? Does this need some buy-in from lawmakers?
Yeah, there are some things the president can do by himself with executive actions or through the agencies. For example, the EPA can put out pollution standards. They can set the fuel economy standards for vehicles on the road to make them more fuel efficient. But at the end of the day, you do need Congress, because what the president is looking for here is a wholesale change in the energy economy of this country. That's going to cost money. For instance, in the infrastructure bill, which they call the American Jobs Act, but it's also a climate bill, it calls for 500,000 new EV EV charging stations across the country. That's going to cost about $18 billion. The president can't do that on his own. Congress controls the purse. You got to go to Congress. You got to get the money. So that's why he's talking about a couple $1 trillion in spending on climate, among other things, in the infrastructure bill. And Congress would have to approve that.
And that's why a lot of people are watching whether this infrastructure bill actually passes. Going back to this goal that the administration set before, and this may not be an easy question to answer, but is this goal enough to actually stave off what President Biden today called, quote, the punishing reality that will come if we don't move?
Yeah, that's a good question, because on the one hand, this goal seems super ambitious. A lot of people are already questioning if we can actually do it. But then you have experts saying it's actually not enough, that even if we were to do 50 to 52% emissions reduction by 2030, which is what the president's calling for, that doesn't keep global warming as a whole below 1.5 degrees Celsius, which is the goal of the Paris Climate Accord. Of course, this isn't just about the U.S. You know, CO2, when it goes up into the atmosphere, is not carrying a passport. Doesn't care what country it comes from. So you need places like China, you need India. Those are the other two super polluters in the world, along with the United States, to be on board with this and to make good on the pledges that they're also making. So this is going to take really every country, every big country in the world to move in this same direction and to actually do what they're going to say. And we should keep in mind that all of these pledges, they're just promises. There's nothing binding about any of this. So this is really countries putting their word out there and all of us hoping that they make good on it.
That's a great point and something for us to follow. Well, a big news on climate change today. Ben Tracy, thank you so much for joining us and sharing your reporting.
Thank you.
And for more, Natasha Korecki and Juana Summers join me now. Natasha is White House correspondent for Politico, and Juana is political reporter for NPR. It's great to see you both. Thank you so much for joining us. And Natasha, I want to start with you because there's the president's infrastructure plan, and now we have a counterproposal from Republicans. Does the White House actually seem ready to give up anything in the name of bipartisanship? Or are they going to try and go it alone?
You know, they've made one thing clear. The White House has made one thing clear, and that is they are willing to negotiate on this. They want Republicans to sit down at the table, and that's because they know that Republicans want infrastructure. This is something they've talked about repeatedly, right? So Republicans came back with a very low number. They came out with a $568 billion proposal, and that's very different than the more than $2 trillion that Biden's talking about in this phase of his infrastructure plan. So obviously they're in very different corners, but Republicans said that was a starting point for them. And the White House keeps saying, we're willing to negotiate. Obviously, there's a lot between those two numbers. But when you have both sides willing to do something, there is some hope that maybe there's a chance here that at least maybe one of the bills they can find some kind of common ground here.
Yeah, and we'll look to see what public polling says later on and whether that puts some pressure on some of these lawmakers at all. Juan, I want to turn to you because Republicans are also working on a counterproposal to police reform. This, of course, in the wake of former Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin's murder conviction. What do we know about this, and what are the chances of it actually passing the Senate?
Yeah, Caitlin, as you and I know, because we've covered it, this has been an area of policy where folks have hoped that there has been some window for bipartisan cooperation, even back since 2015 when Senator Tim Scott of South Carolina got involved in these negotiations. We've heard Scott say on Capitol Hill this week that he does think there is some bipartisan room to compromise on this. And he is even suggesting that there could be action even in the next 2 weeks, depending on how Democrats respond to Republican proposals. One of the big sticking points in this debate over the George Floyd justice and policing legislation, which passed the House back in March, no action yet in the Senate, has been over the legal doctrine of qualified immunity, which is a legal protection for police officers. Scott is offering a different option, a tweak to that qualified immunity protection that he thinks would get Republicans to come on board so that some sort of legislation could be passed. We don't know yet where this will all fall, but I do think that in the press conferences following the verdict for former officer Derek Chauvin, you heard the family speaking out and saying just how much they wanted this bill passed. It's something that President Biden and Vice President Harris talked about in their remarks as one of the key ways in which they believe they could meaningfully reform policing in this country for people of color who are disproportionately arrested and jailed and experience harmful treatment by police. One thing to note, though, I have been speaking to activists who say to me that they think that a watered down version of this bill, and they suggest that the Republican proposal would not be good enough. They also caution that they believe, and these are activists on the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, that a bill like this perhaps would not have even saved the life of George Floyd or some of the other folks that we have seen even just in the last few weeks who have been killed by police.
Yeah, I think that's a big question is what policy responses can actually start to prevent cases like this one. Tim Scott is going to be someone to watch on this front, as you mentioned. He's also going to be someone to watch next week because he was just selected, it was just announced today, to give the response to Biden's first joint address to Congress. Now, this is sort of like a State of the Union, but for a president in the beginning of his first term. Scott will give the rebuttal for the Republicans. COVID will actually force the limiting of guests, which makes it different from years past. And many Republicans actually indicate that they'll snub the invite. So, Natasha, to you, how significant is that?
Well, it's really sending a message. I mean, first of all, there is reporting we saw in Punchbowl News today and elsewhere that, a lot of Republicans were saying they didn't want to be there anyway. But the other side of that is there are GOP lawmakers who have said, hey, this chamber can accommodate 950 people. We should be able to either delay this address so that more people can actually attend or, lift the number up a little bit more. They were talking about people who were vaccinated. They sent a letter to Pelosi saying, in our nation's history, it's unprecedented to convene a joint session of Congress such as this without extending an invitation to all members of Congress. So the White House is saying what they've said for a long time, which is norms are different now. It's COVID. We have to be safe. We're going to do things differently. But we're seeing this clash right now over, hey, then we should delay this. Or, you're saying to open up America. Shouldn't we open up this chamber? Shouldn't we, if there's so many people vaccinated, maybe it can accommodate, maybe not all the 950 people, but maybe we can accommodate more people. So it is a little bit of an interesting dynamic right now. Whether Biden, I think there might be room for Biden to move a little bit on the numbers, but, it remains to be seen. It's pretty new right now that this letter came out.
Yeah, COVID changing everything, and some lawmakers have not been vaccinated yet, which is significant. Juana, some other news on Capitol Hill. This afternoon, the Senate overwhelmingly passed a pandemic hate crimes bill. Now, this is aimed at combating racism against Asian Americans. It seems so rare that anything passes with such bipartisan support these days. Can you tell us what this bill would actually do?
Yeah, so this bill is aimed at strengthening federal efforts to address hate crimes. One of the biggest things that it does is to create a position at the Department of Justice to expedite channels, to expedite the processing of crimes that are reported to law enforcement that are hate crimes, as well as to expand the types of channels that people who experience hate crimes or hate-based violence have to report them. But you're right that it is so incredibly rare for something to pass with this much bipartisan support. And initially, Republicans were a little lukewarm on this legislation. And I think we got here because of a lot of behind-the-scenes work from Hawaii Senator Mazie Hirono, who is the lead sponsor of the legislation, and Maine Senator Susan Collins. They changed some of the legislation from its initial form, adding a section that explicitly denounced racism against Asian Americans, as well as a bipartisan provision that would establish hate crimes hotlines that was sponsored by Senator Moran of Kansas and Senator Blumenthal of Connecticut. And we heard Senator Collins take to the floor and really implore her Republican colleagues to fall in line, to pass this legislation. And the efforts really worked. Ultimately, just one Republican, Senator Josh Hawley of Missouri, voted against this bill. He made the case that it had an overly expansive collection of data, and he believed that is something that could lead to federal government overreach.
Well, still good to see action on this issue. Natasha, before we move on, I know you have some new reporting on the Biden administration's choice to stick with that historically low cap on refugees. This, of course, was under the Trump administration. The quote that stands out from your reporting is this line, quote, "You're not going to throw gasoline on top of that fire. Fox News would have a field day with it." What's the fallout for the White House on this issue?
There's been a lot of fallout. They were actually getting it from both sides, or they feared they would. Initially, they stuck with a Trump era number, a very conservative number, and part of the thinking there was there's a lot of different factors that went to it. One of the things in that quote you referred to is politics. They know this is a politically explosive issue for Biden. You turn on conservative media, and those are the images you see. You see images at the border, and yes, refugees are very different than the border issue. But what the White House feared was Republicans were going to conflate the two, and look, Biden wants to open borders. Look what he's doing. Look at this big number of refugees he wants to now bring in. So he stuck with the cap initially. Of course, there were other reasons as well. One of the reasons, they are taking on water. They are trying to figure out how to keep this issue at bay. He felt that Biden felt, by all accounts, that they needed more time. They needed more time to figure out how to write this refugee program. A lot of it had been gutted by Trump. They say when they took over, it was much more hollowed out than they had anticipated. So they're tackling all of those issues and wanted to take time. Now, the left really came back really strongly. The White House suffered a huge backlash from that, from the original number. And now the White House is now making clear this number is going to go up. It's not going up right now because we're taking our time to make sure we're doing things the right way. But Biden is still committed to increasing the number of refugees that will come into the country. And they're saying before May 15th, they're going to disclose what the new number is. But it was a rare, a rare misstep by this administration that's usually so careful. They were really trying to find their footing on how to handle this issue messaging-wise and politically.
Yeah, and we'll see how Biden addresses the issue of immigration and all of those dynamics in his address next week. Natasha Korecki and Juana Summers, it's so great to see you both. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you.